Zipper rolls out to the right, pitches off to Taylor, and Taylor's to the 20, down to the 15, down to the 10, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Touchdown, Billy Taylor! Touchdown, Billy Taylor! Billy Taylor scored a touchdown from 21 yards out. The crowd goes berserk. It was November 22nd, 1969. That they came to bury Michigan all dressed in maize and blue. The words were said, the prayers were read, and everybody cried. But when they closed the coffin, there was someone else inside. Oh, they came to bury Michigan, but Michigan wasn't dead. And when the game was over, it was someone else instead. 11 Michigan Wolverines put on the gloves of gray, and as the organ played the victors, they laid Woody Hayes away. Under center is Wangler at the 45. He goes back. He's looking for a receiver. He throws downfield to Carter. Who's got it better than us? Nobody!
Welcome to the Michigan Man Podcast on Wolverine Sports Radio, a member of the V Sporto Network, and in partnership with SB Nation's Maize and Brew, for Wolverine fans from coast to coast. Go Blue, and welcome to the show. I'm your host, Mike Fitzpatrick. It has been an interesting week on the Michigan football beat, and joining us with his thoughts today will be Nick Baumgardner from The Athletic. First, my view from Section 17 to get us started. I was hoping Nick and I would be previewing the Iowa game on this week's show, but as we are well aware, the game has been canceled and we know why. National Signing Day was Wednesday, and it went much better than many of us thought it would. Only 2 defections and 20 players signed letters of intent. We still have until February to add additional commits or even save scholarships for players in the portal or graduate transfers. As of now, this class is rated anywhere from 10 to 15 by various recruiting analysts, so not bad considering the drama surrounding the program. That drama is the contract talks to extend Jim's deal, or maybe not. We have no idea at this point. Now that the season is officially over, Jim and Ward should be able to find time to finalize a deal or part ways. No one knows how this process will end up, but hopefully there will be a speedy conclusion. My guest today says if Jim stays or if there is a new coach, the issues remain the same. Michigan football needs a reboot. From recruiting to personnel to attitude and much more, this program needs a fix, and urgently. Here to discuss that and more this week is Nick Baumgardner from The Athletic. So stay with us. Here with us on our Michigan Game Day segment is Nick Baumgardner from The Athletic, and there is quite a bit to talk about, so welcome back to the show, Nick.
Good to be here, Mike, always.
Well, for starters, as we were setting this interview up earlier this week, I thought you and I would be previewing a game this Saturday night against Iowa, but as we all know now, it was canceled. And some fans might say, hey, good, it's over with. Others are going to be disappointed. Either way, it sure was not much of a surprise, was it, Nick?
No. That Michigan had issues with COVID, as we know, for the last several weeks. And what happens there is, and obviously, Michigan sent out their numbers week to week, and it hasn't always been easy to read in terms of, I think they're trying to protect privacy situations, everything else. I don't know how it all goes, but those numbers have built, quarantine situations have happened, contact tracing has had to be a factor. And what I was told was when they got back to practice on Sunday, which I'm not even sure if it was a full padded practice, they had fewer than 40 guys available. And similar to the week before, they tried to start the week with really low numbers. And, I'm not sure how much better or worse it got, but Ward Manuel said in the end that they would have had more than 50 out for that game. So, no, it just didn't. Even last week when they canceled the Ohio State game and they talked about how they were optimistic, I mean, they may have been optimistic for the sake of being optimistic. In terms of reality with the numbers, it was hard to see. And so, unfortunate for everyone involved, obviously, including Iowa, who'd been playing really, really well, and I'm sure wanted to get that other, that last game in. But, that's the thing, Mike, that we talked about back in August. Like, this was just going to happen. I mean, it was something that was, you never knew, there was no promises, and, it's been a weird year and, a tough one for everyone involved for sure.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, Michigan became the only Big Ten team to cancel 3 games this season.
Mm-hmm.
And as we know, maybe it's surprising, maybe it's not, but going from 0 positives, or as far as we know, 0 positives after 6 weeks to this, that is truly amazing and gives you a really good idea how fast this thing can spread.
Yeah, especially, I mean, in state, we've had issues here as well, and I mean, all it takes is a couple things, if a couple people just, don't, maybe go about the exact thing you want that day in terms of, you can't see this person, you can't see that person, and something happens, as you said, Mike. I mean, contact tracing and everything else can really that was the whole thing when the whole deal started, was the ability to kind of put everyone inside, their own world and limit your contact tracing. And then when, a holiday happens, Thanksgiving happens, and if families get involved, contact tracing just gets really, really hard to counter or to keep under control. And, there you go.
Well, there is a lot going on with Michigan football right now, and it's shaping up to be a really interesting offseason and winter. But on Wednesday, National Signing Day, we lost a couple of recruits. Linebacker Brandon Jennings from Florida, Quentin Somerville, a defensive end from Arizona, flipped. But we secured Donovan Edwards and Xavier Worthy. So despite all of the drama around the program right now, pretty darn good class, isn't it, Nick?
Yeah. So it was a weird day, Mike. I'll say that, because you kind of said it at the top. Like, they did lose, 2 pretty, highly touted players. I wouldn't say that either Somerville or Jennings were the best players in the class or anything like that. But, I mean, they were both defensive players, for a defense that needs a lot of help. And, I kind of looked at that as, you only lost 2 guys that were committed, but you didn't need to lose any. Like, if you had this thing settled and if you had this thing signed, because that was, reportedly those 2 kids left because there was no signature. And the rest of them took, Jim Harbaugh at his word. And, we'll see how that all pans out. But it certainly does feel like, Mike, looking at this offensively, all the guys offensively anyway, seem to have a really good bond. I think that's the thing I would take away, that, I think that you give Michigan staff credit for making sure that, people, were well communicated to as best you can, I suppose, because, you got to remember the staffers don't know what Jim Harbaugh is going to do either. That's, I mean, he can tell everybody the same thing, but it's not, until it's official, it's not official. So you credit those guys for kind of working in chaos and making sure that everything was as best as it could be to brace yourself for something that could have gotten out of control, but they were in a good spot with it. And I think most importantly, it seems that, especially the kids offensively, rallied around each other, all decided, they want to be at Michigan. I think a lot of kids on both sides of the ball in this class probably saw this season and said, well, you know what, there's going to be opportunity to play next year because nobody out here did anything to hammer any job home. So I think that's part of it too. We've seen that before. It didn't get as toxic as it could have, I guess, and that's probably the takeaway. And I think that credit for that would have to go to Michigan staff, but I think also to the kids, because I will say this has been a very hard year, obviously, for everyone involved, coaches, players, everything, but the recruits too. I mean, they weren't able to take visits the way that they normally would get to. They weren't able to go around and have people come to their house. The relationship building just wasn't the same as it would be in a normal year, and they were kind of robbed of that, due to COVID. And so I was, I felt for everyone across the board in every class and every school everywhere. You're signing in December because in some cases maybe you've been put in a spot where you're like, well, I got a spot here promised. I don't exactly know everything about what's going on here because I haven't had the ability to really scour or survey the landscape like I would normally. But if you were comfortable with something, I think that you saw nationally this year people went with it. If you weren't, they rolled the dice, and it was going to be kind of a we'll see situation because of all the restrictions and everything else. But I think you credit guys like Giovanni El-Hadi, they talked about being the first commit in the class and a kid that really worked hard to make sure that other kids wanted to come and play together. JJ McCarthy doing the same thing, and some other guys in there too, especially offensively, because that did stick together. But yeah, I would say overall, not a really good. It's a good class. You'd like to see more on the defensive side though, and losing anybody at this situation in this spot really it kind of stings, and I didn't think it was necessary when the day started.
For the last 6 years, a lot of the national recruiting analysts have talked about the fact that Michigan needs to step it up on the recruiting trail, maybe rethink the evaluation process. As we all know, winning would solve a lot of those issues, especially beating Ohio State. But clearly, how Michigan is recruiting and maybe the type of kids they are targeting needs to be reevaluated, which is not a bad thing, is it, Nick?
No, not at all. I mean, you can't. The days of trying to come up with a reason or excuse why people being upset is over. It's just not. That's got to go away. You were 2-4. They were 2-4. They were exposed. I know it's been a COVID year. We're in a time now with football where you can create a narrative for anything you want, especially right now, and a lot of it would be justified, right? Because things are difficult, things are tough, it's hard. But the more you do that, and the less time you just stop and look at what you're doing and say, maybe that's what the problem is here, is wasted time, in my opinion. Because, yeah, you're right, Mike. I mean, I don't have the exact answer of what needs to be done here. I know a lot of people get hot under the collar about the Ohio thing, about how they don't have enough of a presence in Ohio, which is notable. I'm not going to say that it's not. I don't know if, loading up in Ohio and just living in there would solve all the problems. I don't know that would be the case. Brady Hope was able to bring really good players in here during a time when Ohio State was under that, Jim Tressel, Urban Meyer transition. Once Urban got things rock and rolling, that stopped. That should be noted. That stopped. Brady did not go into Ohio and just dominate his entire time there. He did it for 2 classes, and then Urban's put an end to that. So I'm not sure. I think a lot of people fixate on geography and don't really understand what's happening. And I think a lot of times Michigan will take kids defensively, especially that John Brown finds that can be maybe labeled as projects, kids that are going to take a couple years, kids that aren't probably going to be ready immediately. And you're not counterbalancing that enough anyway with kids that are ready right now. And defensively, to find kids that are ready right now, that's the hardest thing to do, I feel like, in recruiting, especially up front. The defensive tackles, the linebackers, everything else, those are really hard. Those are premium players, cornerbacks who are ready to come in and play right now, premium player. They're not getting those premium players to sort of balance with the guys they're taking that are projects. Like Josh Uche was a project. Josh Uche worked out, but that's 2.5 years that after he signs that you just can't play him, and it works out in the end. And you maybe didn't even get all the and there's an argument there to be made too that you didn't get all that you could have necessarily in terms of playing time out of Josh. But I mean, he's also a guy that wasn't ready till the end of his career, and so they've got a lot of guys in here like that, and that's the difference. In 16 and 17, those early Jim Harbaugh classes, they signed a bunch of guys that were ready to play right away. They were ready to go, and they just aren't getting as many of those right now. I think a lot of that has to do with, the wins and losses on the field. I think a lot of that has to do with, Michigan staff does not have a reputation on the recruiting trail, and you can ask recruiting experts, as a super aggressive staff. They just aren't, and that's just not their rep. Right or wrong, it's what it is. It's what's talked about. And so, yeah, there are things, I think, in terms of overall plan, organization, aggressiveness, what you're trying to do, where you're trying to go, and how you're trying to balance your roster that, you need to be looked at to avoid situations where you're, because we also can count into and say, they need to recruit their own roster better, make sure they, stop losing as many players off their own roster. And then what ends up happening there is the bottom of the class falls out because there's not enough to hold on, and then you're just left with a bunch of guys who are still developing. So, yeah, I think a lot of that needs to be looked at hard this offseason, one way or the other, and I assume it will be. And, it's time. I mean, this recruiting staff here, for the most part, has been here since 2017. It's not like they were here for a hot second or 1 or 2 classes or whatever. It's been, 3 or 4 now. Mm-hmm. So I think, something like that. So, yeah, I think it's fair to say that they should be evaluated, and we'll see what happens.
Well, this whole recruiting thing, you mentioned Ohio, and that's been talked about for the last couple of years. Why aren't we in Ohio more? There was a piece, I think, in the Detroit News on Wednesday on why Michigan is not getting more kids from Ohio, and some of the big programs and coaches down there say they don't even hear from Michigan anymore, which surprised me. I mean, given Michigan's success down there for decades, it's awfully hard to explain that, isn't it?
Yeah. I mean, I think that there's it's two things, and I think, again, like I said, I think some of it ggets overblown and some of it gets underblown. Like, you know what I mean? I think there's one side that says it doesn't matter, and that's not true. And there's one side that says, it's we need to be in there and, all the time. And I'm not sure if that's the answer either. But, Ohio's a better recruiting foothold base, whatever you want to call it, than Michigan, and has better high school football competition talent, overall in terms of the entire state, year after year. And it is still, a hotbed, I suppose. Not maybe what it was in the 80s and 90s. People have moved, obviously, but it's still, a place where you would think you'd need to be. And it's a place where there's a lot of really good high school football programs that take high school football really seriously. And, over the years, as I've watched, players sort of come up, the guys who are ready faster are the kids that you find from places like that. They're kids, and there's a lot of schools in Ohio that are really, kind of year-round programs. I'm not sure if there's as many in Michigan. There are some, like, what Ron Bellamy has there, what they have at Belleville or at Cass or at King in Detroit. I mean, those are legit programs as well, but, like, there's more of them, I feel like, in Ohio. And so, you see other programs, like you'll see Mel Tucker get in there in Ohio and find some good players. I know you will. You've seen what Cincinnati's been able to do. Kentucky has built its program based on guys that maybe Ohio State doesn't quite want. And so the argument there is Michigan's not going to get any closer to Ohio State and necessarily by being better in Ohio, but Michigan's not going to get into this situation, I would think, by being better in Ohio. That is really the thing. The foundation of your class is the spine of them, has been wobbly. You can put the cherry on top with guys from all over the country if you want, but there's no, when you're haphazard with your geography and you're all over the place, you're finding kids that have a fit with you and everything else. But I mean, are you finding kids that are familiar with your program? Are you finding kids that can come in and be leaders earlier in their careers? Or are you finding kids that are coming in here and learning? And I know that that's not everything, but like, proximity in some cases like this matters. I mean, these rivalries, you find a kid from Ohio that really wants it and is really good to come up here, and he's going to fight pretty hard in those situations, right? So, we talked about with Harbaugh's first couple teams, Jake Butt, Taco Charlton, Chris Wormley, Ben Gideon, all these guys from this, I think Ben was, DeMonte Thomas, I believe, was from Ohio. All these guys from Ohio that were really good football players that came up here and meshed really well with a bunch of kids from Detroit, and it worked. That's, Jim Harbaugh was from Ohio, from Ohio, right? So that's the thing I think people look at and say, I'm used to seeing more of a spine, that's got a foothold in Ohio, Pennsylvania, in the Midwestern kids that understand sort of what Michigan wants to be as a program, what they want to do, and you don't have to teach them. And I know that's not everything, obviously, but, I can understand the argument on both sides. I really can. I think Michigan should be better in Ohio than they are. There's no reason for it. You could hire staffers who can go into Ohio and recruit if you can't do it yourself as a head coach. It's not something that should just be ignored. I don't think it is ignored, but it clearly isn't being emphasized enough. And, I think that that's something to address. I don't know if I would argue that's a reason to overhaul your entire operation, but, it's definitely notable. And I think something that should be addressed at some point here soon.
Oh, absolutely. Okay, well, let's get your thoughts on the hot topic now the recruiting's over, and that's the contract extension. Now the season is officially over also. Wouldn't you expect there will be some resolution pretty darn soon?
Yeah, I would think. I don't know that for fact. That's always the thing is, Jim, is impossible to predict. So I don't know that for certain. I would, though, expect, now that the season's over, now that signing day is over, and they still have to recruit, obviously. The period actually doesn't close until Friday, but there should be time and a window here in the next handful of days, as we're sitting here talking, Mike, on Thursday, for them to sit down and hash this out, for Ward Manuel and Jim Harbaugh to sit down and hash this out and come to a final decision. It's again, it hasn't been, we've reported for weeks and months probably now. It hasn't been anyone's preference at Michigan to see this thing extend into 2021. The only reason I can see that it would extend into 2021 would be Jim Harbaugh trying to continue to survey the land of the NFL. And if I'm Michigan, I'm not letting that happen. I mean, like, if he wants to do that and doesn't want to sign, then it's time to move on. I think that would be on the table, but I'm not sure that it would happen either, because it hasn't happened by now. So we'll see. I don't think it'll last forever. I mean, we could have resolution here before Christmas, or it could last until, it could carry over. I don't know. It'll all depend on how, quickly they can sort of come together, and how quickly, really, at the end of the day, Mike, that Jim Harbaugh comes to the decision or conclusion on one of the two things. One, he believes he's supported and wanted here. Two, he believes he's not and isn't supported here. If he believes he's supported here, he'll sign whatever they put in front of him. I have no, but if he doesn't, and he thinks they're just sort of trying to pick between two pretty not ideal options, then I think Jim Harbaugh is going to make sure that he gets everything he can out of that deal, because I don't think he's going to feel supported. And I'm not sure if that contract would do much to give you long-term stability anyway, if people don't think that, this is going to be a long-term deal. So we'll see. That's something I think they have to hash out. And I think on Jim's end, he has to hash out to Ward Manuel, what are you going to do to fix this? Because it needs to be fixed. There's a lot of things that need to be repaired here. Staffing decisions, philosophical, schematic, everything. I mean, everything needs to be evaluated. And so it needs to be a pretty big plan. And I think that that's also something that they need to sit down and talk about. And we'll sort of see. I mean, they've gotten through signing day. It could have been worse. It wasn't. Now we'll see how, just sit down, get this thing fixed, figure it out one way or the other, so you can move forward with the kids on your team right now and they know what's going on. That's the most important thing.
If Jim stays, extends his contract, after year 6, a lot of folks think blowing up the staff seems like the thing that has to happen. Others, might say that's a sign of desperation. Brian Kelly pretty much did the same thing, though, and at Notre Dame, and it worked pretty well. But after a season like this, it sure seems like the program needs a jolt in some form or fashion, doesn't it?
Yeah, and I would say, Mike, I mean, I don't know what, people can have different definitions of desperation, but for me, this would be, that's where Michigan's at. If they bring Jim Harbaugh back, it's desperation time, because it's reset time, it's fix it, it's comeback time, whatever you want to call it, right? Like, you're going to have to prove to us that you can turn this thing around, because it went south, and it didn't just go south this year. It had been slipping for the last couple of years, and they have got to be honest with themselves in this moment. That is the most important thing, is to be objective and honest with yourself about where you have been going as a program since the end of 2016. It hasn't been upward. It hasn't been stable. It has been, with a couple of blips up in 2018, but more or less it's been on the downward slope. And so you got to be honest with yourself. And I really feel like sometimes Jim Harbaugh does a great job of that, and sometimes he does not do a good job of that. And that, lately I feel like the latter there, the not doing a good job of that, has been more prevalent than the guy we saw early in his time at Michigan, who would make decisions that needed to be made when they needed to be made, even if they were difficult. And now you're here again, and there's a lot more of them on the plate. And that's the ultimate question. I've been told this whole time, from talking to folks, that Harbaugh's well aware of all this and, is fully prepared to make change. You just don't know how sizable it would be and what all would happen. I don't know how much we can read into, even signing day, Mike, where you say all the offensive kids were back. Is it possible Jim Harbaugh went to those kids and said, I plan to be here and I plan to have Josh Gaddis with me? Is that possible? Yeah. I mean, I think that seems like it's possible, given, the fact that the class gets sort of held together offensively. But defensively, no, you've got to do something different, one way or the other. It's not working, obviously. Then nobody has any faith in the plan on the field. Nobody seems to have any on the sideline. Not working. So, you have to figure out something there too. And, and like you said, Mike, the recruiting area as well, I think would be another one where you really got to look deep into.
We've seen so many traditional power teams struggle this year, Nick. It's not just Michigan. Look at LSU, and hey, their recruiting classes are right up there every year, and they are coming off a national championship, struggled mightily. So when you look at what Michigan has right now coming back, and that could change with the transfer portal, and then you factor in this recruiting class, does Michigan have enough talent on this roster to turn this thing around in a positive direction next season?
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, I think they probably have enough to be. I know they have enough to be better than this. That's the situation that I would say turn it around. Though I don't know if they have enough to have a great year. I don't know if they have enough to be a 10 or 11 win team. But I think they have enough to be better than this. And I'm not sure what people want or believe Jim Harbaugh needs to give them one way or the other on that. I suppose that would be subjective. But really, the thing that's been super concerning here to me this year. Obviously, when you have injuries, it exposes your depth and your lack of depth, and that's what happened here. But more than that, like the disconnect between player and the kids just looked like they didn't have any faith in anything that was being implemented on the field. Zero. And other than maybe a handful of kids, but I mean by and large, what you saw out there was a bunch of kids who just looked lost, and that was alarming in many of those games. And that is why, I think a lot of people are in this, maybe it's time to move on here and, and have been for several weeks and maybe months, because that's alarming. That's not something that, you can just chalk up to like, well, I mean, maybe you can, maybe it's all things, right? It's, the COVID stuff, having to grind through all this, everybody got wore out, one or the other, but man, one way or the other, that's got to get fixed. And there's some disconnect there between Jim and the roster, because they're not, they weren't able to hang in there. They just weren't able to, trust confidence in what they were being taught. Obviously, it just didn't work. And injuries obviously play a role in that. But that's the thing when you talk about it. Like, Jim's got to look at this really hard. Everything. Urban Meyer's talked about it on TV several times. It's not necessarily about just firing everybody and starting over. As much as it is, because if you do that, that's great. But if you have the same problems, you know what I mean? Like, that's not going to fix anything. So, the guy at the top has to be the guy who fixes all that if he's still here. And, that's on Jim to do that. And I don't know what that looks like, but, it's become pretty obvious that, when things are getting difficult or things get challenging for these teams, the last couple of years, we've seen this, they go south very fast, and they don't hang in there. They don't roll with the punches. They don't sort of just, okay, that was a rough quarter, let's bounce back here and see what happens. Like, no, it's like that was a rough quarter and now that's a nosedive. And, that's really alarming, and that's stuff that is hard to ignore and hard to unsee. And that's the stuff that is in front of Jim Harbaugh now that he has to make people unsee by, if he is back, having what I would argue would be probably the best coaching job that he's done, certainly here and maybe anywhere, because I think that's what's in front of him here. This was not a accidental dip. This was a situation that had gotten, sort of rusted out and needs to be fixed. And that's the deal. The good thing, I guess, if you're looking at it from Michigan's point of view, would be that that's Jim Harbaugh's strength. He's never had to fix his own mess before, but he has been good over the years at fixing messes, usually created by someone else, but still harder to fix your own, but not impossible. And I suppose we'll see how it goes.
Well, we sure will. So in the coming weeks and months, it will be interesting to watch if Jim stays, how he implements change, and that will give us a lot to talk about during the winter months. This Saturday, though, Nick, Northwestern and Ohio State meet in the Big Ten championship game. It's a 12 noon kickoff. And, I love Pat Fitzgerald. I love what he does with that program, gets the most out of his talent. Everyone has to realize that.
Yeah.
That said, I cannot see them hanging around along with Ohio State. Can you?
No. I mean, I said that a couple years ago, and they gave them more of a game than I thought they would, even though that, and they played hard. And I would expect that is probably what we'll see. I would expect them to fight really hard, and probably, maybe even give them more of a fight than I'm probably giving them credit for. But in terms of talent, no. I mean, it's not even close. I mean, I don't know what Ohio State's at right now. I mean, when they played Michigan State, they were down a bunch of guys, to a point where it was questionable maybe whether or not they seemed like they were right on the line in terms. So they had a lot of work to do there in terms of getting guys out of quarantine and everything else. So we'll see where they're at with that. But, Ohio State's offensive line is incredible. Ohio State's defense is completely loaded. Justin Fields is the best player in the Big Ten. It's not even close. It would be a pretty big – I think selfishly, I would have liked to see Iowa against Ohio State. I think that maybe would have been a better game, but also you have to say that, well, Northwestern beat Iowa. And I know that it was early in the year, but that's kind of what Northwestern does. So, they do a really good job of taking advantage of your mistakes, but at some point in every game, they have to be able to make plays when you start making plays. And that's sort of the formula when they play teams of this caliber. They fight with them for a while, and then the talent wins out, and I assume that'll be what we see there on Saturday. And I think anything else would be probably pretty surprising, maybe borderlining on shocking if Northwestern pulled that off. But it seems like Ohio State's game to lose. Yeah.
Well, the playoff teams are going to be decided after this weekend. It's championship weekend. Let's just say it's Alabama, Clemson, Notre Dame, and Ohio State. Who do you like to win it out of that group?
I mean, probably Alabama. I wouldn't rule out Clemson. I think Alabama, Clemson are clearly the best. It seems like anyway. Ohio State's been tougher to gauge because they haven't played as much, and they did struggle a little bit with Indiana, but I really liked Indiana this year. I thought Indiana was a lot better than people probably realize. Notre Dame, I like Notre Dame, and I think in this scenario, given all the uncertainty, they've seemed to be able to hold together pretty well. I feel like they have probably good leaders on that team, play really hard. I don't think Notre Dame's talent level is quite at the Alabama or Ohio State level. They did beat Clemson, but I believe Lawrence was out during that game,
Mm-hmm.
So was he out during that game?
He was. He did not play. The freshman backup played.
Yeah, right. So, that has to be taken into account here, too. I mean, Notre Dame would probably be on the bottom end of that in terms of talent based on what we know who's on those rosters. But, I mean, I've watched Alabama a few times this year, Mike. Their offensive line is insane.
Yeah.
If you had to give the Heisman to anybody, it would be Devonta Smith at Alabama or Alabama's offensive line. Those would be my votes for Heisman because they have just steamrolled through everyone they've played. And Clemson has had some COVID issues, I think, that have gotten in the way, and we'll see about all that. Lawrence is an equalizer, but I would say Alabama would probably be my pick. Alabama, Clemson in the final, I would probably pick Alabama to win that.
Well, a final question, Nick, before we let you get away, and this is one I get a lot from my listeners. And, as the season ends and we look forward to what happens next, it's something I think about. And I like to tell my listeners this, Michigan football has not been elite for a long time.
Mm-hmm.
Good most years, and then very good every so often, sort of like Notre Dame. Are the glory days, do you think, behind this program, or is it still possible for Michigan and Jim Harbaugh to really reinvent themselves and compete at an elite level in the coming years, at least every so often?
Yeah, I think it's possible for Michigan, whether it be with Jim Harbaugh or anybody, to, like you said, though, reinvent yourself and, reinvent the program. Because that's it, Mike. That's what this is. The glory days, yes, they're done. Like, that's over. The lineage and the Schembechler to Lloyd Carr, Lloyd Carr retired in 2007. So, people, I think, have had a hard time remembering, time has passed, and Michigan has not carried that through. It has not been a blip. It has not been 1 or 2 years. It has been more than a decade. So those days are gone. If you can bring people back into your program that have familiarity with it and can sort of, appreciate your traditions and appreciate the way you go about doing business. But, by and large, no. I mean, the program, and then I would argue that it has been. I don't think Jim Harbaugh has made decisions based on what's happened here in the past. I don't think that's been his bag this tenure. But, going forward, But Michigan has the resources to do it. They have, the profile to do it. They have the brand to do it in terms of being able to recruit nationally. You saw that yesterday. That should be as much of a sign of anything yesterday. Michigan's Michigan. People still, some kids still want to come here for the school and everything else, and that's still carrying weight. So I think that what you said, Mike, getting into a situation where you're competing with and maybe giving yourself a chance every couple of years against Ohio State, although if they're going to be a behemoth like this, I don't know, how long that lasts. If they're going to be this good for that long, maybe they will be. Maybe they'll, settle back in and we'll see situations again at some point sooner than later where Ohio State, maybe once in a while has a 10-2 season and isn't awesome every single time. So it's possible, I guess, but I think Ohio State would have to dip a little bit, but it's not impossible. And I think the takeaway for me is, especially the last 2 years and then the way they finished in 2018, they're better. They can be better than that. That's what I would say. They can be better than what we saw in 2019. They had better talent than what the record showed. The season completely fell apart in 2018. That's not really acceptable either. This year, obviously not acceptable. They're better than this for sure. And when you look at the early first couple years of Harbaugh, where they were pushing, didn't quite have enough, but were right there. That's really where the program, I think, should be living. And that's not impossible. We've seen that, and I think that's probably a fair you should be in that spot. You can have a bad one or a rough one once in a while. The wheels can't fall off, though, and you have to win some of those red-letter games when you have them on the hook, and that's been the difference. But they can be better than this, for sure. And I think that's the thing I would tell people is that, glory days are all, you look back on them with, fondness in your eyes probably and everything else. But you also have to remember they've won one national championship since, the 50s or 40s or whatever it was? One. Not 10, not 2, one. So, people who think they should just be in this national whatever every single time, it's just never happened here. So, I don't know why that's something that I can see that as a wish list, but an expectation, no. That's just not realistic. So, but better than this, yes, and I think that's definitely possible. I think it should even be expected because this is not good enough, and I think everyone would agree with that.
Absolutely. With us on our game day segment this week has been Nick Baumgardner from The Athletic. Nick, always a pleasure to have you on talking Michigan football. It's going to be a very busy winter, so I'm sure after the new year we'll get you back on and see what's happening with Jim Harbaugh and the program if Jim's here. So until then, you take care of yourself. Have a very Merry Christmas, and we look forward to that next visit in the new year.
Outstanding. Sounds good. Same to you, Mike.
So it should be an interesting few weeks as we wait for a determination on Jim's contract and what happens after he re-signs or even decides to pursue other options. We will, of course, have the latest for you on next week's show. Now that football season is officially over, at least for us, we will return to our regular schedule of one show a week. Unless there is breaking football news this week, I think we'll start paying attention to basketball. Juwan Howard's team is off to a 6-0 start, with games coming up on Christmas Day and New Year's Eve. It looks like it could be a very exciting winter for hoops and hockey, but they will also be dealing with the same COVID issues all season long. So make sure you join us next week. That does it for another show. Thanks for joining me, and please tell your family and friends about the Michigan Man podcast. I'm your host, Mike Fitzpatrick. Have a great Wolverine week, everyone. Until we meet again, take care, and as always, go blue.
Thanks for joining us today on The Michigan Man, here on Wolverine Sports Radio, a member of the V Sporto Network, and in partnership with SB Nation's Maize and Brew. Our listener lines are open 24/7 for your calls at 313-263-4842. That's 313-263-4842. Or email us at themichiganmanpodcast@yahoo.com. That's themichiganmanpodcast@yahoo.com. The Michigan Man Podcast is produced at the studios of Robin Lynn Productions, Allen Park, Michigan, and is not affiliated with the University of Michigan. Go Blue!